Coalition, and we are joining this morning with the Central Mass Historical Commission Coalition and the Eastern Mass Historical Coalition to have a meeting about cemetery preservation. We're really excited. It's a topic that there's a lot of interest in, and this is the first time that these three historical commission coalitions have joined to have a joint meeting. So we have a great crowd, and we're really excited to have three wonderful speakers on this topic. So I just want to mention the steering committee from the different historical commission coalitions who joined forces to put this presentation together. My name is Beth Giannini. I work for the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. I'm joined by Ted Harvey from my office. And we're part of the Western Mass Historical Commission Coalition, along with Shannon Walsh from the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Laura Brennan from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, Chris Skelly from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, and we from the Montechusett area. I'm sorry, Lindsay Randall from the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission worked with us. She is from Eastern Mass, and then Glenn Eaton and Karen Chapman from the Montechusett Regional Planning Commission. Karen, let's see, Trish Settles from Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, Carrie Salwa from the Central Mass Regional Planning Commission, and Jen Doherty from the Mass Historic Commission, Jeff Gonyu, who's at the controls from Preservation Massachusetts, and Stacia Capelson from the Preservation Massachusetts also. Sort of fumbled through all those names. I'm sorry. I'm not used to us all getting together to pull these workshops. Just to mention kind of where we're coming from, I'm part of the Western Mass Historical Commission Coalition, along with Pioneer Valley and the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, as well as Mass Historic and Preservation Massachusetts. And we hold meetings quarterly. We rotate between our three regions, which is the Pioneer Valley region, the Berkshire region, and Franklin County, and bring historic preservation related topics. And then we're joined by the Central Mass Historical Commission Coalition, who kind of does the same thing for Central Mass, and the Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition. And they kind of hold the same type of informational meetings, and Preservation Massachusetts and Mass Historic are kind of members of the steering committees on each of these three separate regional groups. So they're kind of helping and guiding us and providing a lot of assistance to have these wonderful workshops related to historic preservation. So that's kind of the framework. We're always open to ideas for topics. We meet regularly and plan our quarterly meetings, and we're always referring back to information that we've gotten from members of historical commissions or anybody interested in historic preservation on topics that we can bring to you. We've been holding these meetings virtually, which has worked out really well, and I feel like we get a very robust participation in the meetings. So as far as this meeting, I think if you have questions while the presentations are going on, please put them in the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat during the presentations, and then we can bring the questions up to the presenters at the end of the presentations. We haven't discussed if we'll take a little break after each presentation and maybe ask a few questions, or if we'll save all the questions for the end. But so let's see, our topic is cemetery preservation, and we're going to just we're going to take the first we're actually going to take the two case studies before the presentation by Dennis Montagna. So the first presentation will be by Rachel Meyer from Epic Preservation, Inc. And her case study is called Respecting the Living Through Caring for Their Dead. And I'm going to just turn it over to Rachel at this time. And like I said, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat and we will be certain to ask them of the presenters.
Wow, Beth, thank you so much. I was actually feeling a little anxious even thinking of remembering all those names. So I think
I didn't do such a great job. I kind of fumbled through them, so I feel bad. But I am thrilled that we're all working together and this is so exciting. So
before I share my presentation, I just want to introduce myself a little. I'm Rachel. I'm half of Epic Preservation. We're a gravestone conservation business that really serves the Boston area to southern New Hampshire. We don't really go too far out of an hour away from our home, which is Ipswich. So, you know, I've had to approach historical commissions as a conservator, as a private citizen trying to, you know, honor the dead, as you said, but also I serve on the Ipswich Historical Commission with Lindsay, who I can see in our little Brady Bunch blocks. So that's a little bit about me. I understand both sides of conservation from both a commission standpoint and as an individual. So when Lindsay asked if I would do this, the idea was that I would talk more about some of my special pro bono projects and maybe a little bit about some of the, you know, the hurdles that we have to jump that people don't think about having to jump when you're talking about preservation when it comes to African-American graves or any grave of somebody who's underrepresented. So we're just going to hop right into it. So let me just share the screen with you. Is it sharing sideways now?
It is still portrait, not landscape.
Are you able to see the slide properly?
It's a little small. Oh, you're going.
Okay, let me change it. My run through with Josh clearly didn't stick.
Well, Zoom always does that, right? It doesn't matter. Somehow it will change. That looks much
good
better.
now?
That's
your
good.
landscape.
Okay. Now. First hurdle. Zoom presentations. No, I'm just kidding. So the project that I wanted to really talk about was the African American, that's a segregated section, Howard Street Cemetery. That it's a project that when I was working for the DPW in Salem, you know, I caught wind of when a private citizen said, hey, you know, there's this lady in the back of the graveyard at Howard Street, and she's the sister of Lucretia Brown, who invented the Joe Frogger cookie in Marblehead. And here's a cute picture of Josh and I. And so it was a project that, you know, I heard about when I was working for the DPW, but because it was only me, I was the only person on staff and I didn't have help, I couldn't do it while I was an employee. So, you know, fast forward to 2020 and we're in a pandemic and there are riots on the street because of shootings. And I don't feel comfortable going to a protest. You know, I just lost a parent to COVID. I didn't feel, just even from a public health standpoint, like I could go take to the streets and be around a lot of people during the pandemic. I thought, you know, this is the perfect time to revisit this project that I couldn't finish at the back of Howard Street Cemetery and sort of give my love to these people who are suffering and do my part publicly to say I care when I couldn't show up and protest or anything like that. And a lot of these pro bono projects I take on, I'll have that in mind. They're kind of love letters to people that I think need some love. You know, I take on some stuff having to do with women, of course, feeling sometimes part of a underrepresented community myself. Also in this back section, I'll get a little bit further into it. This is a section that was laid out for people of color and strangers. And you'll find that in a lot of these segregated areas, not all African-American graves are in segregated areas. Even in Salem, if you were to go to Harmony Grove, there are African-American graves mixed in with all the other graves. But, you know, oftentimes cities laid out these segregated sections for people of color and strangers, meaning immigrants coming over that don't have any family here and they need to be buried somewhere, put into a certain section. And also back here is a woman who died from her mental health, a little bit further out from this segregated section, that I'm also interested in telling her story because she's also left without descendants to advocate for her and her gravestone. So, but back to this section in particular, these are the 3 gravestones that I found when I was told by this private citizen who knew I was going to Howard Street, you know, that were in that back area. And I wasn't sure if these were the only Black graves back there, if there were people in unmarked graves or what was going on. But you can see Venus's stone to the far right. They were all broken, sunken. You know, some had their lower pieces in the ground, some were missing things. Still hard to know exactly, you know, how these gravestones were configured. I sort of lucked out and found in the Phillips Library a inventory from the 1950s that a group of ladies put together of this back section of Howard Street, which is like the later section. And it mentions a few other, you know, gravestones that may have been in this area, one being Venus's sister Patience, which is missing. And so here are the gravestones. This is like actually after I took them out of the ground, I put them on while I was working for the DPW because I only had, it was only me, I didn't have a helper. The best I could do was to take the fragments out of the ground and put down some sand and pea stones. So just to improve the drainage underneath them, because Venus's stone was sugaring, which means the mineral content was leached out of the stone and the marble was looking like sugar. So this is how I left it when I left the DPW. You can get an idea of how segregated we're talking. This is the far back section, and the gravestones on the lower left are the African-American gravestones. And it's literally bumped out from the rest of the cemetery. Let's see if I put in a map. Yeah, here's a map. So about halfway down the cemetery, so the whole of Howard Street was laid out in 1801. About halfway down the cemetery is a line of tombs, and everything behind that line of tombs, between that line of tombs and the jail is, so there's a jail there. So you already are feeling sort of like this is the outcast part of the cemetery. All of that is the newer stuff, and that's where they put the people of color, where that yellow circle is, and the strangers are sort of surrounding that area, as well as that young lady I was telling you about that was found in the river. And that blue circle is African-American church, the history of which has never been told until we found these gravestones. And it was an abolitionist church that was built by Samuel McIntyre that was taken apart in the 1800s and everything sold, brought to Beverly, and it burnt down Beverly. So there's no trace of that church left. But it was really neat by using these gravestones as interpretive objects to tell the story of these 4 people, well, 5 people, if you count the ones that are in unmarked graves. We were also able to tell the story of the abolitionist church next door. So this is a during photo. We have Samuel Payne on the left. In the center, we have Prince Farmer and his wife, Mary. They're on the same gravestone. And what's cool about that is Prince's gravestone, the lower half was actually sunken into the ground. You wouldn't have known his wife was buried there at all. And to the right, you have Venus Chew, who is the sister of Lucretia Brown from Marblehead, Lucretia and Joe Brown. Not sure if these names are going to ring a bell for some of you, but there's a middle school named after them now. And Lucretia Brown, of course, invented the Joe Frogger cookie, but I absolutely fell in love with Venus's story while repairing her stone. you know, she was an African-American woman, so she had this intersectionality of both racism and sexism going on. And she was the wife of an abusive man, Henry Chu. And Henry actually has a house out toward Greenlawn Cemetery. He was a mariner, and she left her husband during a time it was very hard to leave your husband, and lived on her own for 20 years. And during those 20 years accrued some, you know, some money in a bank. I'm assuming she was a baker like her sister, but that's an assumption. She accrued this money, and because her husband still had debt, the Supreme Court, like this went all the way to the courts, went after her individual money as a woman and her really slanderous things in the local paper, but she shot back and was like, "This is my, you know, this is my fortune. How dare you?" Like, she was, I found her really inspiring. And even though she lost her court case and her husband was allowed to claim her fortune for his debtors, I just love her. I love Venus. I hope you'll love Venus too. These are the gravestones repaired. The one in the middle that belonged to Prince Farmer, he was a oyster merchant, and one of the things he was kind of famous for is that he sold oysters to Nathaniel Hawthorne. So he actually had his base, but the other two we had to pour bases for because there was no bottom half material left to reset them or, you know, mortar them back together. And so this yellow circle, so we thought because of that inventory, there was a missing gravestone in the 1950s for Patience, I mean, for Venus's sister Patience. And I was really hoping this little stub that I found was her gravestone. You know, we went through this whole thing where we were going to get the gravestone replaced, but I couldn't dig without permission. You know, Salem has a lot of rules, and we adhere to them by the letter. But that meant that there were mysteries that we couldn't solve until, you know, we jumped through all the hoops to solve them. So it was like we were trying to replace her gravestone without knowing if that was even her grave. And unfortunately, it wasn't her grave. It was actually the grave of a 9-year-old child. And you can see the name is missing. We don't know the name of the child. I'm not sure that this gravestone even belonged there. There wasn't a lower half, a broken lower half in the ground that suggested that this gravestone was broken and just kind of reset low. There was nothing that indicated that this gravestone actually belongs to an African-American child. But even so, we reset it where we found it because there's no knowing where it belonged, or, you know, if we could find out whose it was or where it belonged, then sometimes we'll move it to its original location. But Howard Street has no maps and no good maps from back then. So we couldn't figure out where it went. So it went back in the ground. Here's what we could find of the inscription, mostly illegible. And we just set it up a little bit higher so it wouldn't go missing. Here's the back side of the lot. And so now we're still left with where are we going to put a replacement stone for Venus's sister Patience? And my thought is putting a flat plaque in front of Venus's headstone, but it's still TBD. This, you know, if you count the amount of time that I spent on this back working with the DPW, we're actually 5 years into this project. So, you know, it's a long haul project. Oh, so one of the things I also wanted to mention to you guys is if you're looking for projects like this where you feel like certain segments of your community, because we're all, you know, as historical commission members, historians in general, you know, part of our job is to represent the history accurately of our municipalities. And sometimes that means that you have to go looking for that history in order to bring it to light. You know, I think there's a tendency to just celebrate what we already know, and we don't realize that history is actually very dynamic, and what we tell depends on who's telling the story, right? So here's a case in point that's pretty cool. We were doing a gravestone assessment in Lynnfield, Massachusetts, and we were looking at a map while doing the assessment because we wanted to also, you know, we'd just like to really be aware of the landscape and anything that we notice that might be hinting at something else. So in this map, I wonder if I can zoom. Let's see. In this map at the very bottom, you can see written in cursive, strangers on the left and people of color on the right. And so there were no gravestones for either, but here's a picture of Josh's hand pointing at what may be an embedded fieldstone. We're not 100% sure, and only an archaeologist would be able to confirm, whether or not there are actual burials in there. But there are a few fieldstones. Unsure if they're embedded fieldstones marking graves or parts of the rock wall that managed to come into the section or what. But these are sort of things that you want to look for when you're looking for these areas that were set aside, is maybe not all of them have gravestones like the Howard Street Cemetery does. Maybe some of them are just embedded fieldstones, so maybe some of them have nothing. But if you look into your maps, your old maps, you might find mention of something that may help you to tell the history of, a more integrated history in your town. And so some of the challenges, Lindsay had wanted me to really talk about the challenges that I face as, these aren't projects that stem from Historical Commission, although, as Lindsay can tell you, we've done quite a few amazing projects that help us feel like we're telling a more integrated history in Ipswich. We just named a park after Jenny Slew, who was the first woman to sue for and win her freedom from slavery. We did a plaque for the mill workers strike. We adopted Indigenous Peoples Day as a historical commission. And, we have other things that we're doing too. Those are just the things that I personally spearheaded. So, there's a lot you can do as a historical commission, but these projects are more me as an individual, unpaid, going in and trying to do my part, knowing that I get paid by municipalities a lot to repair gravestones that some may be slaveholders, and knowing that it's very rare to find mention of, or even gravestones of African American people. And when you find them, you need to celebrate them because they are so rare. So anyway, some of the advocacy challenges is this difference between commission-led initiatives and citizen-led initiatives. When something is initiated by a historical commission, there is a sense of camaraderie and consensus, from the commission that we kind of want to go forward with this. Everybody in the group knows how the commission works. But when something is brought to you by a citizen, there's almost an emotional aspect to it that doesn't exist when it's coming from within the commission. You have an individual that might feel they might be an underrepresented individual trying to make the case about why this history is important. And that's a really emotional place to be. Or they might be like me, like, I want to do this thing for free. Why aren't you listening? Just things to keep in mind is that it's not an emotionally balanced situation when you have an underrepresented person trying to plead the case of marking a grave or taking care of something, as opposed to somebody who feels like they have a lot of power. Funding is a little dicey when you start going into the African American funding. There was a new bill passed for, preserving African American graves. And I know I'm talking a lot about Black graves, but this isn't limited to Black graves. We're talking about any underrepresented community, be it your immigrants, your women, anybody. But the funding for African American graves, it seems like there was a bill passed to help fund these initiatives, but there doesn't seem to be a way yet to actually apply for that funding. So it's a little confusing. The historical lack of accessibility to decision-making spaces for underrepresented communities. Why am I having such a problem with that word? Look at your historical commissions. You're going to see very few people of color in them. And, in my work, when I'm doing a project like Howard Street, I reach out to groups like Salem United and I say, I want you in the room. And often these groups have been marginalized and have been in opposition with the city, not working with the city, but having to, like I said, plead their case against the city, which automatically makes the city the bad guy and the person, people need to work together more. And a lot of these people didn't know these meetings existed. You know, they don't know that they can go to these planning meetings for historical commissions or cemetery commissions, or, you know, they could even join, you know, like a lot of this, people have been kept out of the room for so many generations that they don't even know where to look for the door. So a lot of this work is showing people how, you know, making people feel safe to be in your space and not assuming that people know what's going on. You know, it's hard to advocate for your ancestors when you haven't had access to government and, you know, the like. So the belief that certain histories can only, you know, be told during certain months or holidays, or they can only be put on African American maps or women's history maps, you know, things like that, that's a real deficit. And I feel like they're, you know, you want to, of course, follow the lead of the people that you're trying to represent. If they're celebrating, you know, Black History Month, yeah, celebrate Black History Month. But we need to remember that this isn't Black history or women's history. This is American history. This is all of our history. And it belongs in our vernacular 12 months out of the year, not just one, not for a special holiday, not to just get likes, but all year long. And as far as maps, you know, we have this problem in Salem where there would seem to be a main map where most of the stops were just white people, witch trial, sea captains, and very, very little mention of African American history. But then, you know, let's make this alternate map that could be for Black people. And I was imagining having to bring one of my great nieces. I come from a family that's of, you know, multiracial, having to bring one of my great nieces down and being like, well, here's the white people map and here's the Black people map. Let's go. You know, it doesn't feel right. It should all be integrated together. So that's a frustrating thing where you're segregating history as though you're in a segregated section of a graveyard. So lack of genealogy groups for underrepresented communities, obviously, as a Mayflower descendant, as a witch trial descendant, I have a multitude of groups I can go to that map out my genealogy for me. So if somebody were to say, if I were to want to repair a gravestone having to do with anything to do with my genealogy, I could easily present that genealogy to a historical commission or cemetery commission for permission and say, hey, look at this. But just keep in mind, other communities don't have that. And more often than not, you're looking for descendants that don't know their descendants. This happened recently at Marblehead, where they wanted me to come up with a list of, you know, a majority of descendants have to sign off on, and this is a happy ending, so I'm not angry with Marblehead. A majority of descendants have to sign off on repairing Joe and Lucretia's gravestone. But we made the case that there just isn't, that's not equitable for the African American community, and they waived that for Joe and Lucretia. We did find a descendant, but me and Geo Ford, who if you're looking for a genealogist, is like literally the best genealogist. He's a descendant of the Browns. He's also a descendant of the Ramones from Salem. He tracked down all these descendants, and we literally cold called them. I've never had to say the words, I swear this isn't a phishing scheme, more in my life, but we were able to get a descendant to write a letter, but only one. And she didn't know she was related. We had to explain it to her. So don't assume that everybody has equal access to their genealogy. They don't. Also, you know, stigma, the idea that we can't talk about things that maybe our personal ancestors did to other people, like oppression, slavery, sexism, that we should just be wiping that clean. It's not a way to heal your community to pretend their history didn't exist or that their history didn't matter. One of the best ways to heal your community and to make people feel heard and seen is to honor their roots and their heritage and say that you care about them. And that sort of brings me to the last point, which is redefining what your ancestors are. You know, we think of our ancestors as our mothers, our great grandfathers, cousin twice removed, but we don't realize that our ancestors are also our spiritual ancestors, the people that have shared our faith, our work, also our land ancestors, the people who molded the lands and the towns and cities that we represent into what they are, and that we're benefiting from all of these ancestors, just not not just our familial ancestors, and that we have a responsibility to all of our ancestors to accurately represent them and tell the truth about their past. And it's through that I believe that we can start healing our communities and making people feel whole and heard and like they matter. So I'm going to leave my card up for a second. You can screenshot it. If you have any questions about the work I do for towns, for families, feel free to contact me. I have to say I've never left an email unresponded to. I'm really good about responding. I didn't get into gravestone preservation to get rich, obviously. I got into it to connect with people and to, you know, restore some decorum and dignity to, you know, to death and to our ancestors here in Essex County. So yeah, you can always contact me in any of these ways. All right, I'm going to unshare. I know that was a little long-winded, but
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. Let's see. I'm gonna we'll do a few questions right now. I didn't know, Lindsay, I didn't know if you wanted to just jump on for a minute and just talk about your work with Rachel at MAPC.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Lindsay Randall. I'm the Regional Humanities Specialist for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is one of the partners for the Eastern Mass Historical Commission Coalition. Yeah, I'm a trained archaeologist, which is sort of how I began knowing Rachel far before I joined MAPC, or that we both joined the Ipswich Historical Commission. And so she's done other presentations for me related to sort of African-American and other under-recognized group stone conservation and everything. And it has just been really interesting to watch because it has brought forth things I hadn't thought that we needed to think about, particularly related to one size fits all kind of regulations for what we expect when we have people who come to us who want to do like gravestone conservation, right? Like it wasn't until I had these conversations with Rachel that you're like, of course, right? Because of slavery, Jim Crow laws, many other sort of exclusionary practices that have happened in our towns and in our country, right? That you don't think, because it doesn't impact my daily life, to be, you know, difficulties to do these genealogies, right? So how can we be more flexible in how we think about many of these issues that come before us in our towns? It has just really been a very moving experience having to face these thoughts and these considerations that I hadn't had to really think about before, but I have a lot of gratitude for the conversations that I've had with Rachel regarding this, and and that we can share it in these spaces and to talk to all of you about this.
Thank you. I'm just quickly taking a look down the list of the questions that have come up, and just one thing that came up. I'm gonna just see if there's any we can answer, or I may hold. There's a few that I think we may want to hold till the end, because the other speakers may be able to either answer questions or give more information during their presentations, and if not, we can have more information at the end. But one sort of general question that came up has to do with the presentations being available and the slides being available. And generally what we've done in the past is we just check in with the speakers and make sure they're okay with us posting a PDF version of their program. And Preservation Massachusetts holds kind of all of the documents on their website. They're available, and they also have a YouTube channel where they make the presentations available for somebody who wants to view them later on. And if in the event somebody really wanted presentation email directly to them, they, feel free to reach out to us about that also. But we generally just post it to make it easier for everybody to access. And then there is a question about how the stones were repaired, and I'm not sure if we want to take that question now, or if the other speakers, it may be something we're going a little more in depth with the other speakers.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it.
Oh, sure.
So we found, I was told where the stones were. I lifted them up carefully, but they were deteriorated pretty badly. So I knew that at some point they were going to have to be consolidated, which means that I was going to have to reintroduce the mineral content that had been leached out over time to re-solidify the stones. That didn't happen for a couple of years because I needed to get a lot of permissions even to just dig in the section. So these things sort of take time. So I put them down on that bed of sand and pea stone to allow the water to drain, and it did a great job. I didn't see any additional sugaring when I lifted them up again a few years later. So that did a good job. So, which we do is we excavate for missing pieces. We look for the bottoms of the gravestones. We see if it had a base. Some of these originally did, some of them didn't. Some we were able to find, some we weren't. When you're not able to find a base, we pour a new base and mortar it in with a lime mortar. And, it's if we need to use, say a break is in the middle of some wording and we don't want there to be a big gap. In those cases, we'll use an epoxy, a restoration grade epoxy like Aquapox. And then we'll, epoxy it together, mortar and fill it with Lithium-X or another high lime mortar. Or if it's not in the middle of letters, we just go right to the mortar and we mortar it back together. We clean it with D2 biological solution. And we consolidated the ones that were coming apart, and we check on them constantly, especially in a high traffic place like Salem, where people like to get up on the stones and hug them. So, so we make sure, if there's something happens, we're there within a day to fix it or to make sure everything is okay. I hope that was a fast enough answer.
Yeah. And just to be a little, there was also a specific question. Did you use the epoxy from Atlas Preservation to repair the stones? So I don't know if that's.
Is this an employee of Atlas Preservation?
I have no idea. Yeah.
we love Atlas Preservation. So yeah, we order our epoxy, our D2 from Atlas Preservation. We order our mortars from US Limeworks in Connecticut, and everything else you can kind of Depot and all that. But if you want that kind of information where I get things, you can message me. Again, I've never left a message unanswered. So, I'm happy to help.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. All right. I think we're gonna move to the next presentation, which is Martha Lyon. And she's from Martha Lyon Landscape Architecture, and her presentation is Cemetery Preservation in the Pioneer Valley. So I'm going to turn it over to Martha. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for logging on to this. It's a great group of people, and I see they're from around the state, and I'd love to see that. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for asking me to speak about this topic that is so much a part of my life and has been for a long time. I also wanted to mention that in addition to being a landscape architect, I am also the chair of the Northampton Historical Commission. We have 4 historic cemeteries in Northampton, and I'm very intimate with all of them. So I can relate both as a practitioner in this field, but also as a person who's on the municipal end and dealing with preservation issues from that angle. I thought that what would be really useful to all of you, because I know a lot of you do represent historical commissions, and I noticed in some cases people who are involved in cemetery associations, to talk about some of the concerns that some of my clients have expressed over the years. So I will address those, but I first wanted to talk a little bit about why we think it's important to preserve historic cemeteries. And I think this was probably most lovingly expressed very early on by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who spoke about Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, who wrote, "In this quiet valley, as in the palm of nature's hand, we shall sleep well when we have finished our day." The man could write. So there are many reasons why we do this preservation work, but I think that Rachel addressed some of them. First of all, they are keepers of our stories. Many of them will be repositories for individuals who are parts of communities for centuries and really can document the whole history of a family, a small village, or an entire community. And so those stories are very, very important to document and to share, and cemeteries are sometimes the best places to do that. There are also outdoor museums, and I can't stress this more strongly, the fact that so many of these stones that have been carved, a lot of times by local artisans who worked in local regional shops using native stone, cannot be replaced. And so once they are stolen or broken or severely damaged, they're just not something that can be replicated, because they were made by real people with their hands and with their heart. And so the idea of just recognizing that you have an outdoor museum, and it's really like having a collection of artwork that you would see in an indoor museum, but it just happens to be exposed to the elements. These stones need the same type of protection and stewardship. These are both stones from the Pioneer Valley. The left is Basil Dorsey, who was a participant in the abolition and reform movement in Florence, Massachusetts. And on the right is a stone from the Adams Cemetery in Wilbraham, which was carved out of local red sandstone. There are also quiet open spaces. And I recall a film that was made by the trustees of reservations many, many years ago. And one of the participants in it was in advocacy for the trustees, was saying that so many of our communities, especially in New England, are really running out of space. And what's left as open space is golf courses and cemeteries. And I don't know about you, but when you drive around on a beautiful day and maybe you want to just take a break or clear your mind, often go into a cemetery and you have this beautiful pastoral, green, quiet landscape. And they're so valuable for that purpose and deserve care as a result. They're also home to flora and fauna. And I can't think of the number of cemeteries, burying grounds I've been in where I've seen coyotes and bobcats and all sorts of species of birds, turtles, if there's a pond. And they're keepers of flora as well. And this is a crop of native plant that sprung up in Westfield early in the spring. So I want to talk now about, as I mentioned earlier, some of the concerns that I've seen over the years working in the Valley, actually across Massachusetts and New England and into New York State. Now, there are many concerns that are out there, especially the cemetery is large, it's old, it's being encroached upon. But I've picked sort of 4 that I think are the major concerns, and hopefully these can relate to you. You can relate to these. The first is that a lot of them are invisible. And when I say that, they're there, but we don't really see them. This is the Bridge Street Cemetery in Northampton, where I live. And I had lived in the town for a long time and knew this was here. It sits at the eastern end of town. So if you're coming along Route 9 from Amherst, you cross the Connecticut River, and you're starting to approach the city center. It sits on the right-hand side, and for so long it was surrounded by this chain link fence. For a short period of time, my husband I rented an apartment near this in the city, and I would go out during the day and walk my dog, and I just could not believe that this beautiful cemetery with, full of headstones that I later learned dated to the 1600s, was surrounded by this fence, put up in the 1950s. It had rusted. It was sagging, and what a terrible way to announce this very, very important historic landscape and very old resource, probably with some of the only original topography in the city, to visitors from the town. So a few years ago, the city was very fortunate to receive a donation from a private individual to erect a different fence around the cemetery. Now, this cemetery is 19 acres, so it's quite large, and it is surrounded by city streets. It was not possible with the funding that was available to erect an entire enclosure of this material because of the cost. But what we did is we selected the most visible stretches of it, the stretch along Route 9 that you see when you're coming in from Amherst, across the river and coming in from Amherst, and also the stretch that leads around the corner to the main entrance to the cemetery. These granite posts had been just sort of forgotten. They were sitting behind that chain link fence, and we opened it up, restored the columns, and then created a beautiful gate to mark the main entrance. So what I'm saying here is that, part of the visibility is just the curb appeal. A lot of times you'll drive by these burying grounds and you just don't really see them because there's nothing announcing them. There's nothing to say, look at this as an important place. I urge you to think about that in case it's an issue in your community. Secondly, is a lot of them are misunderstood. And when I say that is that, again, we drive by these and we don't realize what's inside them. As Rachel was saying, the stories that are being held here. This little burying ground, which is located in the west part of Pittsfield, which of course, that's why it's named the West Part Cemetery. Again, something that you would just drive right by. It sits across the street from Berkshire Community College. When I was asked to go look at this a few years ago, I couldn't find it. And finally I did. I worked on a project here to help to restore this. But what I learned in the process of doing the restoration is that the people that were interred in this property, just again, the people that you may just not remember. These are people who lived in the west part of Pittsfield, helped develop that area as a farming community. It was also the location of the almshouse, which is where Berkshire Community College is now. And so a lot of the people interred here were people who either were residents of the almshouse or were workers in the almshouse, as well as I mentioned, farmers in the area. And that's it. It's this very small collection of stones in this tiny little rectangular plot. And so part of what was recommended in our planning process, we did an entire plan for this little property that included updating the enclosure, creating more of an entrance, but also recommending that they develop some signage to either just welcome people to the cemetery, to let people know why it's important, and then also is sort of an interpretive plan to look at how this property developed and why it was important into the larger community of Pittsfield. So again, acknowledging the importance of these places and putting it out there for people to see is really, really important. Okay, the next concern that people have, and this is a big one, is the cost of taking care of these places. And this is especially an issue if a cemetery is no longer active, meaning there are no burials going on. It's been closed to new burials. And the cost, from what, again, my experience, what is really driving up the cost of caring for these are several things. The first, as you can see from this image, and it's taking almost half of the image, is pavement. So many cemeteries in this part of the world and probably all over are just filled with pavement. These roads that were put in probably originally were just gravel or maybe just dirt and turf. In the 1950s, asphalt became a very popular material to add to cemeteries. And so what you see is these circulation routes running through historic cemeteries that are way too wide, and they're covered with asphalt. And there are too many of them, and they're covered with asphalt. And asphalt, as we all know, it's a petroleum product. It's very expensive to maintain, especially in a climate like we have. So the idea of reducing the amount of asphalt as much as possible is a really good one. And it's something I urge most of my clients to consider. So often I'll get pushback saying, well, there's no place to park. Or what do we do when we have a funeral? No, there are all these cars in here. You know, you don't have a funeral 25 times every single day of the year. The funerals are infrequent typically. If you have cars, they can park on the edge of the road, partly on the grass. If you're concerned about grass being worn, you can reinforce the edges, but you certainly do not need a whole network of 20-foot wide paved roadways in your cemetery. Okay, the next item that's driving up costs in a lot of communities is caring for trees. Now, trees, I know, because I'm a landscape architect, are a very important part of the aesthetic of cemeteries, and they add tremendous beauty. We're both taken to the Bridge Street Cemetery. On the left is a tulip tree, which is just one of the most magnificent tulip trees I've ever seen, and it's in pretty good condition. The pine on the right, however, is really nearing the end of its life. And one of the problems that trees present in cemeteries is that they, once they get old and they start getting weak, just like people, they have the tendency to fall or to de-limb, as we call it in the trade. They lose their limbs. And when those limbs come down, you know, you see what they're headed for. They're headed for the stones underneath them. And I have seen in so many places after a big windstorm or a microburst, just gravestones that are decimated by tree limbs coming down. So there are two things that I recommend. One is that if you do have a cemetery that has a lot of old trees in it, I'm not recommending they all come down. But I do think that communities and owners of cemeteries need to pay attention to their condition and have them cared for on a regular basis, because the damage they can do is really quite substantial. The other thing is that it's okay to take them down. This tree on the right, as I said, you can see it's leaning. It's losing a lot of its lower limbs. It's had a great life. But just like people, everybody needs to kind of move on. And so taking that out is not a problem. But what is a problem if you are going to replace trees is some thought needs to be given to what type of tree species should be put in. So many of our trees that are native to this part of the world are really in trouble. And some of the arborists that I work with on a regular basis are recommending that new trees that are brought in are really trees that are geared towards a warmer climate, like a mid-Atlantic region climate. So that would be what I would recommend for replacements of these. But again, that will help minimize the costs. Again, one, caring for them on a regular basis, and then also not being afraid to remove trees that are in trouble and have had a really good life. And then the last expense that creates a tremendous amount of costs and also can create more damage than we would like is turf, grass. You know, so many cemeteries have turf covering all of the ground plane. And while it is lush and beautiful and lovely to lie on, it's very expensive to maintain. Again, to keep it looking nice, to keep it trimmed. A lot of the people that take care of cemeteries, I have to really credit them for hanging in there and having to work around all of these stones, but they also do a lot of damage with their trimmers. The best way to address this is to gradually introduce ground covers instead of turf. This is actually the God's Little Acre in Newport. Rhode Island, which is a Black burial ground. These ground covers have gradually started to come in, and the city is pledging to just continue to plant ground covers whenever there's a disruption in the turf. Just don't put in new grass, to use a ground cover instead, one that will be hardy and will proliferate. So those are three sort of sustainable, I would say, techniques to trying to minimize your costs and preserve the landscape. And then the final concern that so many of my clients have, and this is a project that I worked on a few years ago, and I've re-engaged with, and I think the head of the Riverside Cemetery Commission is here. So Janet, you can hear a preview of what we're going to be talking about in November. So many cemeteries are running out of burial space. They, often were founded in New England in the 16 or 1700s, a certain amount of land, and over the years have interred hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe have expanded a little bit. And now they're at the point where they don't have any more land, and there's no more land in the town to purchase. And even if there was, it would be unsuitable for cemetery use, and it would be unaffordable. So what I have worked on with many of my clients, and Riverside is one of them, is a plan to try to think a little bit more broadly about the type of interment that can be introduced into a historic cemetery that not only provides more burial options, but also melds with the character of the historic landscape. And this is what we did at Riverside. So here is the old section of Riverside. You can see the beautiful slate markers that are all lined up, and there's a lovely table tomb. And this is a very dense area of the cemetery that is the oldest, as I said. And you can see the trees. So, they've got a bit of an issue or a concern about keeping these trees in good shape, because imagine if these came down, what the kind of damage they would do to those original stones that were hand carved by local people. So what we did was we came up with a plan here for reusing some of the existing space that was laid out many years ago, just repurposing it. And in this case, reclaiming some of the existing roads that are not really being used. And as you can see, they're covered with asphalt. Again, another expense to the town. This cemetery actually happens to be right on the Connecticut River. So there's concern about the environmental impact of maintaining asphalt here. So converting the roads that are not being used, in this case, to full casket burials, which are still desired by the town. In the center section of the cemetery, closing the main road and instead narrowing it, making it a pathway, and along the pathway, installing in-ground cremation sites that would be lined up all along the pathway, and the pathway would circle around the main flagpole in the cemetery. And then in the southern part, this is the only land that they still have available. And you can see this image on the right shows you what it looks like. It abuts an agricultural field. This area that we developed several options for burial, and this was at the request of the town. They wanted more in-ground full casket burial sites, as well as a scattering garden, which is an area where ashes are basically placed in the ground, not in an urn, but just placed in the ground, and usually commemorated by some type of a group marker. And then also a cremation garden area where the same type of thing would happen, where there would be scattering and then just kind of a garden space to commemorate. So all of these approaches, again, provide more options for the town, but also make the best use of the very little space that they have. And I have to mention, if anyone has never been to the Riverside Cemetery in Sunderland, you will know where it is because it's right next to Mike's Maze. Okay, and then I wanted to talk with you a little bit about a form of burial that we did not recommend for Riverside, but I am recommending for a number of my other clients, including the Green Lawn Cemetery in Salem. One of the things that, again, a number of historic cemeteries have turned to because they have no space is the idea of building these columbarium walls. And what a columbarium wall is, it's an upright structure. Oftentimes it's just like a straight wall. In this case, this is a project I'm working on in Rochester, New York, a series of curved columbarium walls. This is an old road that the city no longer wanted to use. And we have created a pathway and then this serpentine route that leads through what we're calling a cloister garden. So these walls, which have columbarium niches on both sides of them, just wanders through this middle area. There are some beautiful trees that we were able to keep that created a nice canopy over the space. And this is an in-progress construction, construction in progress photo, which I thought would be useful for everyone to see. It's hard to imagine this in plan, but this shows you what it's like under construction. These are the walls. You can see the old road has been excavated out. And these walls are a little over 5 feet high. And what you see the grid, these are columbarium niches, which will take 2 urns of cremains. And then here's another alternative. This is also at the same cemetery in Western New York. This was an island, a traffic island in the cemetery. And what we did is we closed the one connecting road and created a pathway leading into, again, what will be a columbarium space. And here's the columbarium that is being built here. You can see it's 2 tiers with 5 niche high, and I think these are 3 niche high on the either wing. And then this will be a paved gathering space. So this provides another option, especially if there's just absolutely no land to work with. And it can be combined with other forms of interment, such as scattering gardens, to be very effective as well. So my final thoughts on this, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, are just to summarize. I'm repeating what Rachel said. It's very important to uncover these stories and also to identify the artisans if you can. Probably many of you know that there are some wonderful books out that have documented the work of artisans working all over the state. There are also some experts on that who are around that kind of help with that, to identify who these people were. They tell a great story in and of themselves. And then, as I said, preserving these as open spaces and homes to flora and fauna are very important. And then my main recommendations are to improve the curb appeal, just like real estate, right? To tell the stories. I wanted to mention one other great way of telling stories is if you have a local historical society who likes to conduct tours, doing cemetery tours is very popular. I know Historic Northampton takes interested individuals on tours of the Ridge Street Cemetery, and it's always a popular thing to do. And then also to get children to come in, school children, and look at the stones to tell stories about local history, as they're learning that as part of their curriculum. Implementing sustainable approaches by minimizing pavement, taking care of the trees, minimizing the turf, and then not giving up because you're out of space, that there are different approaches to including new interment through different kind of interment options. Well, thank you. And thank you to all the individuals who let me work with them or photograph their property and present it to you.
Thank you, Martha. That was great. Thank you so much. I'll just ask a couple questions that are in the chat that seemed like they would be great questions to ask you. One was very specific. Is that Mount Hope Cemetery in
Yes.
Okay. And then let's see. Oops, it just switched and I lost.
Just while you're looking, I'll just mention, I don't know if anybody remembers though, but in the last the presidential election where Trump won, which what was that, 2016? I don't remember now. Susan B. Anthony is interred at Mount Hope Cemetery. And I don't know if any of you saw this because it kind of went viral on the internet. The I voted stickers that are given to you when you vote, her gravesite was covered with them. It was really quite a moving scene.
Thank you. I'll have to look for that online.
Frederick Douglass is also buried there as well. So
oh, cool. A question that I see that I think is would be great for you to give us any insights is what are best practices for putting up street or directing signs in cemetery?
best practices. Well, the practice of naming roads and cemeteries came about during the rural cemetery movement era, sort of the early to mid 19th century. And many cemeteries had their own vocabulary for that. I'm thinking if you've been to Mount Auburn, of course, that's sort of the most well-known rural cemetery style property. I know Greenlawn Cemetery in Salem has them, but I believe Harmony Grove does too in Salem. And they had their own sort of cast iron style that was developed, and many of them still exist. So that's something that can be replicated because you have a pattern for it. But a lot of cemeteries don't have that, although the roads are named. And so I've seen many different approaches to doing that, like a granite column that might have the name engraved on the side of it. Just a small little, maybe road marker that sits closer to the ground. There are many different ways of doing it. I don't know if to ask the question. I guess the best practices answer would be if there is a vocabulary that was developed that dates to the time of the naming of the roads, that would be something that would be desirable to replicate if possible. So.
Great. Thank you. And I'm just going to note if there's a lot of really great information sharing that's kind of going on in the chat right now. So if anyone's I just encourage you to just kind of take a look through there. It's really wonderful. And we will now move on to our first presenter, who's now our last presenter, Dennis Montagna. From the Association for Gravestone Studies, and his presentation is Planning for Cemetery Documentation and Protection. I did see Dennis, and I just want to make sure that he's got his presentation ready to share because I can pull it up if need be. So I know Dennis was having some computer issues earlier, but hopefully he's got that all set. Let's see. Now I'm not seeing Dennis, so I don't know if
Bethy's here and he's unmuted and his camera should be on. So Dennis,
okay. Oh, there we are.
Say something. Okay, so I see Dennis there,
Yeah.
and he's unmuted. And Dennis, if you can hear us, if you can say something just to confirm that you can hear and we can hear you, that would be great. Still not hearing you.
Okay. Well, while we're sort of waiting for that, I'll just look through. There's a question right now. Will the chat comments be added to the video you're making available to the public? Jeff or Stacia, do you usually make the is it possible to make the chat available? Do you know?
It should be.
Yeah, I think it is possible.
Okay, great. Because I am noting a lot of really great ideas about cemetery tours and costumes, and having just family members talk about different gravestones, and and cemetery walks. So it's great to like get those ideas and do some information sharing. Shannon shared a link to a cemetery walk from Springfield Preservation. Let's see. And Halloween is a great time, I guess. lots of cemetery walks, nice time to get out, and also kind of fun because of the holiday. Let's see, some bicentennial.
Can I ask a question of Martha?
Sure.
Okay, so my question was, so I've noticed because of climate change, we're losing a lot of trees in our cemeteries. I'm wondering what the effect of the asphalt. I'm noticing a lot of those trees are along the asphalt drive areas. I'm wondering what the effect of asphalt is on the trees. Does it cause the trees to have shallower roots, or is it just the health of the tree?
Well, asphalt is pretty impermeable. And so if a root system is, trying to survive underneath it, it's not going to do well. So I know, I'm trying to think which project I worked on. It was a while ago, but anyway, I think it was in the Berkshires, and they had a lot of sugar maples, and they were using, some kind of calcium to diminish the snow and ice on the roads, and that really, really had a bad impact on the trees. So if the cemetery is plowed, and also there's some kind of salts used on them, that will be a huge problem. It depends a little on the tree species. Trees that are more comfortable in urban settings will do better if the roads are salted, but no tree really likes salt. And then, of course, so many, as I mentioned, so many of our native trees are really being threatened by disease and also pests. And the pests mostly have come in on container ships from Asia. So the Asian long-haired beetle, which is attacking the maples, and there's an emerald ash borer that's killing our ashes. Our beaches are in trouble. So it's really quite, I often say this, I was in graduate school over 30 years ago. And at the time, the only real pest we were concerned about was the woolly adelgid, which was affecting the hemlocks. And now there are so many in the last 30 years. And it is because of climate and also because of trade.
Thanks, Martha. Because I sometimes, we have these microbursts that come through, and I remember when I was working for Salem, we would lose it felt like a dozen trees a year just from the wind. And I don't know, that seems strange.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason why it's important to stay on top of the condition of the trees and to care for them. And as I mentioned, take them down if they're not, at the end of their life. It's okay to do that, really.
Thank you. I see Dennis is back. I'm wondering if he has his sound. Just do a little check-in with him. I see a question. Let's see.
Yvonne Harrington.
Yep. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi. Can they leave the web address up a little longer? There's not time to even get a screenshot. They need to leave it on the screen a little longer.
Oh, great. Okay. Yep. And
Thank
we
you.
could also add those into the chat as well, if that's helpful.
Oh, good.
Links.
Thank you.
And let's see, one thing I'm reading, and maybe I'll call on Jen Doherty. She put a plug in the chat for making sure your resources are documented. So maybe just Jen, I don't know if you want to jump in and just talk a little bit about that. And she did share a link for the Form E for documenting burial grounds.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. So this comes up a lot, when we review projects at the MHC under state and federal law, we rely on what is in MACRIS. And even if you all know that it exists, if it's not in MACRIS, we can't do anything to help you protect it if there's a project that's going to be coming through. As an example, just this week, we had an inquiry from a community where someone on the historical commission knew of a burial ground, an African American burial ground that was, out in the woods somewhere. It wasn't in MACRIS, but the site is being considered for a sewage treatment plant by the town, which we obviously don't want to see. And so we were able to work with them to complete an inventory form and add that property to MACRIS. Sewage treatment plant is likely going to fall under our review. It will likely require federal or state permits, licensing, or funding. So now if that project does move forward, we do have a record of that site. We can work with the community to protect it as it goes through that permitting process. So, it's great if you're doing conservation work out in these different cemeteries or burial grounds that you know of in your community. But do always check MACRIS and make sure that what you're working on is actually in there, because that's really how we can help you protect it. And it's really just important for us to know about these sites and know that they're there. So yeah, I did put the form link in there, and links to MACRIS as well, MACRIS and MACRIS maps as well. But if you have any questions about completing a form, certainly reach out to us and let us know. I see a question that just popped up. What does MACRIS stand for? That is the public database that the Massachusetts Historical Commission maintains. It is the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System. And so it's a database of documented properties, documented historic resources all across the state. Thanks.
Jen, can you do a MACRIS for individual parts of the cemetery? So say you have a segregated section that no one knows was there, kind of like you would have a historical, like a historic area in a town, but also individual houses. Are you able to?
I don't know. That would be a question for our inventory form staff. Usually we like to, if it's a cemetery or burial ground, we like to, obviously kind of have the whole thing documented. But I think if there is a specific history or it's a site that was kind of set up separately than the rest of the burial ground, I think there could be some argument there about doing a smaller inventory form for a specific location. Thanks. Yep.
Thanks everyone for bearing with us. We're just trying to help to get Dennis online, and maybe I can pull up his presentation. I know he's having some computer microphone issues that we've all at one time or another ourselves run into. I know. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask at this point, just while we're trying to sort out the technical difficulty?
I just wanted to add, we had about 15 years ago, we had a very interesting project over in Templeton. They had a children's hospital over there at one point. I believe it was the first one in the state. And the children that were buried in the cemetery were only there by numbers. The graves had numbers on them, and that was it. And we had a cemetery commissioner that actually went back, and a lot of the numbers just had one name with it. But he went back and made sure every grave had a name with it, so they now have great names rather than numbers.
It's a great, oh, maybe
A
Dennis
lot of
may
work
be
that was
joining us.
interesting.
Very good.
I
Thank you,
think I'm
Carla.
I think I'm with you. I think I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Ah, there we go.
Let's see. I can, Dennis.
Bunny. So you guys can run the PDF that I sent to Ted, right?
Yes, let me just give me 1 minute
Okay.
now to get myself together here. I'll pull it up. And
This is a great example of why it's really good to send a copy of the presentation ahead of time.
yes. Okay, here we go. I'm going to screen share and see if I can grab the right one. Is everyone seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Let's see if I can go. Okay, there we go. All right, perfect.
Great,
Thank you.
good,
Here we go.
great. Thank you. Thanks. So I'll just do the old next thing.
Okay.
And so you guys can change it. That's wonderful. Thanks very much. Thank you everybody for being so patient. It's been a morning. I was able to see the rest of the presentations. I was actually on my wife's computer, so I was able to do that. But then for some reason we couldn't get the microphone to work. So now, I'm on my phone, which I think should work out okay. But anyway, of course, it's been a really discombobulating morning. I think going third is pretty good because, being able to hear both Rachel and Martha, I think this is going to dovetail pretty well into what they were saying. I'm kind of wearing two hats here. One is that I'm an historian with the National Park Service in the Northeast region, and I work a lot on care of monuments and interpretation of monuments and do a lot of cemetery preservation work. In addition, I'm currently serving as president of the Association for Gravestone Studies, and I'll be recycling off that this coming summer. So anyway, I was kind of thought, well, let me use both of those hats and talk a little bit about AGS, how it came to be working with cemetery preservation. And I think through both of those jobs, how I, anyway, have come to sort of understand planning a little bit more. And when we're not going to, with the time allowed, we're not going to really sort of dive deep into planning, but rather sort of talk a little bit about how people get to a point of planning and understanding the role planning ought to play. Let's have the next one.
There we go.
Okay. So all right. So the Association for Gravestone Studies formed in 1977, and it actually formed out of an organization called the Dublin Seminar for New England Folklife, and this was begun in Dublin, New Hampshire. Peter Bennis convened these basically symposia, which people who were scholars, people who were interested in various aspects of New England folklife and work and culture could get together, present, share ideas, and generally advance all of their work. The first topic that they did was actually grave monuments, and out of those came two publications on Puritan gravestones, and AGS really formed out of that. Peter Bennis was the founder of that, and the mission of AGS is a twofold one. One is to basically understand gravestones better, and then to be able to better care for them or better preserve them. So it's that two-pronged approach. Let's have the next. When AGS began in 1977, we began our own publications as well. The one on the left is the first issue of Markers, and the on the right is a more recent one. And I think it actually points up a direction that the organization has gone. We really we've very much been a New England based organization since the founding. New England and Mid-Atlantic states. The focus was really on gravestones, grave cutters, tracing various makers of gravestones and their work, and who where they traveled and all of that. And that was some really terrific work grew out of that. And that's really remains the heart of the organization. We're actually based out of Greenfield, Massachusetts. And so we're really, we're very much a New England group, but we've also expanded, and we really have a national presence now. We have chapters around the United States. People who write articles in Markers are writing on a vast number of different topics. I work on 20th century monuments mostly. So we've really grown in terms of geography, and we've grown in terms of the time period and really embracing interest that everybody has, but still remaining very much sort of a New England themed organization. Let's have the next. In addition to Markers, we actually publish a quarterly, and here's a couple of them that kind of show some of the breadth of the organization. Special issue on children's markers on the left, and then a special issue on mausoleum, and that one is in Suriname on the right. Let's have the next one. We have annual conferences, and probably early on, all of the conferences were in either Massachusetts or they're in the Mid-Atlantic states. We now have branched out, and we meet different places. I think probably a third of our conferences, our annual conferences, are still held in the New England area. This one was in Westfield in 2015. Then I think Westfield got a shout out in all three of our presentations today, which I think is good for Westfield. We do things like having carver demonstrations. On the right, you can see a very typical AGS photo of AGS devotees geeking out over gravestones, which is what we are fond of doing. Let's go ahead and have the next. But we meet a lot of different places now, and I think it's been a really good thing, because it's really gives our membership a chance to go see monuments, see landscapes, cemetery landscapes, traditions, conditions of monuments that we don't really see in the Northeast. So it really helps us, I think, to acquire a much greater visual knowledge. We met this past June in Denver, and this was one of our field trips up to Central City and looking at the marble monuments. These mostly had all been copper miners. And we've talked about the importance of stories and about being able to tie stories into these memorials and give people who lived in the past more of a reality than they might have had otherwise. For those of us in preservation, it's also pretty stunning because we get a chance to see marbles that have not been beat to death by the environment. And to get a sense of what the marbles that we have would have looked like, more like when they were originally cut. And I think it makes us appreciate our own monuments more in the East, because we really can get a full appreciation of the art and the care that went into them. Let's have the next. A key part of our workshops has always been preservation training. Fred Oakley really was the spearhead of that back in our earlier years, and he continued to do that. His wife Rosalie is still very much involved with the organization. And we used to do, and this is where we see kind of like changes over time. We used to have at our conferences, there would usually be two workshops. There would be a beginner's workshop that would cover very limited things, just sort of resetting tablet monuments, cleaning, joining some broken pieces together. And then there was an advanced workshop for people who wanted to learn more about sort of hefting large pieces of stone, repairing stacked monuments, a whole host of more sort of highly specialized training. But one of the things we've done lately, and because we have such a short time to work with at our conferences, what we've begun doing now is what you see on the screen is to have have sort of a two-part session. One is a classroom session, and then the second part is mostly a sort of a beginner's workshop that also includes some of the more sophisticated stuff as demonstration things, but not necessarily as full participatory. And the reason we wanted to, I think, to go with a classroom session is it really allowed us to do things that we couldn't do on site. And when you get on site, everybody wants to go do stuff, right? They want the hands-on, and so it was really hard, I think, for us to get across other types of lessons, other types of information. So that's where that half-day classroom session comes in, where we're able to really talk about planning, talk about doing inventories, condition assessment, and all of those other things that aren't something people are going to pay attention to when they're standing out in the cemetery and they want to start getting their hands dirty. So that's one of the big changes that we made, and that has worked out pretty well. And we pretty much do beginner sessions because most people who take these sessions, they're first timers oftentimes. So it's really good opportunity to be able to sort of inculcate them with sort of proper techniques as well. And also, I think it allowed us to sort of get a broader view of cemeteries and become, in a way, less focused specifically on the gravestones and more focused on the gravestones within a larger landscape context. And we've been trying to really push understanding landscape and having that be a key part of any kind of planning that goes in. Let's have the next. This is an example of just some of the workshops, and for instruction, we usually draw from among our board. We have a very active board in terms of preservation. You see Jason Church, who's with NCPTT, which is the National Center for Preservation Training and Technology down in Louisiana. He's on our board, along with past board members Francis Miller, who works out of Hartford, Connecticut, and Joe Farinini from Hoosick Falls, New York. And you can see Joe is working with a student and basically resetting a tablet marker. Jason up at the top is running a cleaning element of the workshop. And then Francis is showing fills and sort of basically joining broken stone pieces. And then the lithomex and mortar fills that Rachel was mentioning early on. Let's have the next one. And so there, that in terms of there's the AGS hat. I'll put on the Park Service hat for a moment and sort of talk a little bit about some of the planning work, some of the projects that we've participated in. And this is the kind of work, in addition to AGS, that's really gotten us more looking at some cemetery landscapes as the thing to be preserved. And the stones are an element, they're a really key element, but there's this whole kind of ecosystem, and there's as we say, many moving parts. And so being aware of that is really important, because you really have to take action on all of it. And Martha talked a lot about that in terms when she was talking about trees and the importance of doing really good tree maintenance. AGS has a history from its early days of preservation training as being really anti-tree, actually. Fred Oakley, God love him, thought the only good tree was a gone tree. He had no use for trees. He saw, that there's no place for them in the cemetery environment as far as he was concerned. And we always used to make fun of him about that, especially because his name is Oakley. But in any event, we had worked a number of years ago on a planning effort for Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. And we had a very specific charge. We were to do a very cursory survey to give them some broad brush ideas about the condition of monuments. So many times you're going to have planning that has a specific focus, and there's kind of no one size fits all. You really have to kind of assess the cemetery that you're working with and figure out what kind of questions you want to have answered, and what's the nature. It's really established sort of what's the nature of that resource before you can really approach how you want to plan for its care. Let me see. I'm trying to read my slide on the phone. So Initially, the mapping component is really important. Then we did a survey and a condition assessment, and then the next thing that really happens is implementation. And you can see this is a project that we had. We had students working on it, filling out survey forms. Let's have the next one. We had really good maps to work with, at least as base maps. There had been both an aerial survey done in the mid-1920s, and then a large plot map of Laurel Hill Cemetery done at the same time. We can only survey a very small part, but we were trying to extract numbers. We're trying to get an overall sense of things. So we actually did a 4% sample of the lot. So we created a random sample by just spinning lot numbers on a randomizer in order to get a random survey. It's not really even. It's not an even survey, but it is random. So we were able to survey 440 of the family lots out of 11,000. And see, family lot was a good way to go at Laurel Hill because that's really how Laurel Hill is structured. It's one of the rural cemetery movement cemeteries, one of the earliest ones. And so family lots is a primary organizing principle. So that made sense. Let's have the next one. Created a survey form. We realized we were looking at a landscape, and we wanted to not only get a sense of the condition of the monuments, but also the relationship of the family lots and the monuments to tree cover. Now, there was an arborist who was also working on a tree component, but we wanted to try to figure out what the impact, if a tree fell, and they had a big issue about lots that were endowed and those were not. I mean, what happens if a tree in an endowed lot falls in an unendowed lot? I mean, there are a lot of sort of questions that went to how a cemetery organized itself financially. So with this, we had a form created specifically for this, derived from many other survey forms that people have done. You're not really reinventing the wheel totally, but looking at family lots, looking at particular markers, being able to drill down a little deeper for information about the family markers, and then major monuments within. So the large obelisk within a family lot to be able to get additional information on that. Let's have the next. And this is what we found. And again, it's really important, and it's much easier now to do it than we did it back. This was probably 15 or 20 years ago, to be able to sort of digitize information and be able to crunch numbers better. But we found out through our 4% survey that there were 29% of the monuments that we surveyed were either unstable or in danger of falling, and that 7% of them had already fallen. So it begins to give you numbers that you could extrapolate, and you can create cost estimates to have, and that's including the coping stones that had shifted, and then monuments where you had stacked monuments that fall over and topple another monument. So these were all pretty typical conditions at Laurel Hill at the time. Next, please. But one of the things we were most struck by in doing this, and about keeping the landscape in view, is understanding the interaction of monuments and landscapes, and the fact that landscape deterioration, the shifting landscape, was a real key factor here, to where the monuments on the left at one point had been up on little earthen mounds. So those are foundation stones. Some of them are mortared, some of them are not, but they really depended upon these earthen mounds that would slope away to both drain water away from the monuments. But now you see them standing up on top of them. Those bases, the marble bases, really should be partially covered. You should never see those foundation stones. In addition, being a hilly site, there was once you didn't have rooted material, you had a lot of tendency of dirt to be washing down the hill. And then part of this was actually caused by what we found as very aggressive landscaping treatments, where they would use string trimmers, and they would be actually cutting channels beneath the monument. So you began to have a water directed into the monument instead of away from it, because of that need that people had to get really close and sort of and dig it all up. Let's have the next. Then the other thing we were struck by too, in terms of the landscape, is the fact that the landscape, and Martha talked a little bit about this, of gravel and cinder paths. In the 1920s, there were still very prominent cinder paths that tied everything together. And you can still read that on the landscape, but those have been let go, and it's all just lawn now. So in that middle photograph, you can see where you can still define a pathway. The photo on the right, that's also a pathway, but when you don't have coping stones, you don't have stones to define the family lot, you really don't see that structure. So there was a very clearly defined organization of this cemetery that really had become lost since the 1920s. Let's have the next. I mean, everything's different. So they used this information. It began to then start to try to get that structure back. So this was a test project. This sort of central round feature as you first come into the cemetery. They recreated that. They basically sort of brought that structure back to the landscape that it had lost. Let's have the next one. And I just wanted to kind of really briefly just mention a few other cemeteries and ways in which we have going about getting information. And I would just say at this point too, that gathering the information, doing your survey is very important, but it needs to go live somewhere, and it needs to be accessible, because despite your best efforts, almost any cemetery preservation initiative loses steam at a certain period of time, and someone will come back in 10 or 20 years and like pick it up again and like do it again. But it really would be helpful to be able to have all of that material that's gathered, all of that documentation, and then have that be accessible. I know that Jen Dougherty from MHC talked about that a little bit in some of the chat earlier on. I think that's really, really important. This is Lincoln Cemetery, which is a historically African-American cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We've begun to do a project there. So mapping was the first order of business. Let's have the next one. And now what we didn't have when we worked at Laurel Hill was we have an ability to really generate maps readily using drone photography, and that you can see going on here. The drone is programmed. All we need is the coordinates of the cemetery. The drone flies in a particular pattern that you can see on the screen on the left, and then shoots photographs, and then those photographs are all stitched together. And we, in pretty short order, can actually get a really good map to begin building off of, to begin tying in information to for any kind of planning that goes on after that. Let's have the next. The drone use was also very prominent at Mount Carmel Jewish Cemetery in Philadelphia. Martha was mentioning things that were going on during the first years of the Trump administration. You may remember that there was a lot of vandalism of Jewish cemeteries. This was from February of 2017. St. Louis had vandalism. We did in Philadelphia too. So a company came in and did actually a pro bono flyover, and we were able to actually assess the greatest amount of damage. There were several $100,000 donated to the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. We wanted to, in putting our program together to respond to that, wanted to make sure that we had a good sense of where most of that damage had taken place. You can see that red area. At the top of the red area was a break in the fence that people came through. They basically went up, pushed everything over, and then began pushing more things back as they came through and went out the fence again. We were able to actually document that by analyzing the drone footage, and then put quite a bit of the effort into trying to work on that section, in addition to standing up at any other thing, restoring any other monuments that were there as well. But again, it begins with the ability to have information and to be able to understand that information, and then how to act accordingly. So the next. So I guess in terms of like the biggest thing that we've learned, I think, is to be able to in cemetery planning is to really see the big picture and see the relationships of different components. You have an historic view of a cemetery with fairly new plantings. You can see how important plantings were to some cemeteries. That's Mount Auburn in the middle, where you have nature and the monuments striking a balance, and a really good job of preserving that balance. And then on the right at Laurel Hill at the time, where things were out of balance, and there that sort of balance between these components was not being maintained at the time. Let's have the next. And I think it's something not for just the big rural cemeteries, but for a lot of the cemeteries you all are dealing with too. Many colonial era cemeteries have lives that go well beyond the colonial or the early republic period. They continue to be burial spaces, and those landscapes continue to change over time. We're working on a project right now at the Rockingham Meeting House Cemetery up in Vermont. It's a National Historic Landmark, and a lot of their monuments that are in great need is in the older section. A lot of these the slate memorials and marble memorials, but the cemetery expanded, so you have a lot of elements that are more like those rural cemeteries, a lot more sort of tree cover, conscious tree planting, family lots. And so in doing any kind of assessment, you realize that you really have to be thinking about these different kinds of landscapes that you all have sometimes operating in the same space, and try to plan for that accordingly. Let's have the next. I think the other thing, and this is it took a while for me to kind of embrace this, because I really wanted everyone to like get your stuff together, get it, get your planning done, really have everything worked out, all the prioritization and all of that before you start like doing things. And I'm kind of come around to thinking, well, there are reasons for doing things. And again, if you want a cemetery preservation project to have legs, if you want it to not kind of peter out as people get old and tired and pass on themselves, it's important to be really, really strategic about it. And part of that strategic behavior, I think, is trying to do things that are going to keep this in front of people's minds, to be able to help you raise funds, to sort of do pilot projects along the way that are going to get press attention, that are going to get the attention of particular donors, because as we all know, money is the real hard part. So we did one actually pilot project at Rockingham Meeting House, small family lot. There was existing family in the area, so there was a lot of interest in the local community for this one. This is the Severance Frost lot. And you can see on the left, before that family lot was sort of put back together, the coping stones reset, the monuments reset, cleaned. And so we have this as a demonstration project. And we're looking for some other ones too, while at the same time having a strong sense of the sort of priorities of what needs to be done, when does it need to be done, what are your greatest at-risk monuments, those really badly leaning slates, that if they break, good luck putting those puppies back together again. So anyway, so that's the kind of, I think in ending, that's what I would say I would sort of keep in mind is, being really, really strategic about any of these planning. Do good planning, be strategic about how that planning is going to be able to bear fruit over a long period of time, because the goal is really to not restore a cemetery, but to have a cemetery that's being actively maintained properly, and to where you're not doing these sort of feast and famine kind of arrangements. Your objective is really to have something cared for over time. Okay, I think that's the last one. So next one I think is my farewell. Yep, farewell slide. So anyway, again, I'm sorry for not joining you at an earlier moment and kind of pushing things late now. But anyway, I've enjoyed talking with you all. And if there's any time for questions, happy to do that.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm going to unshare. I was just leaving your email up there for a moment. I think there are some questions in the chat. I have to unshare so that I can see what we've got. All right. And I don't know if, let's see, get my bearings here, because we did get a bunch of questions. We only have a few minutes, but I think we can do a couple.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's see. I'm just going through to look for some I know one thing that came up, and I don't know if is about funding, available funding, and I don't know if you have any thoughts or ideas on that. About funding is always a big question.
Well, I can put my sort of federal hat on for a moment. Yeah, funding in terms of cemetery preservation or preservation in general, most of the funding that the feds give really goes through state preservation offices. So it's like federal money that then gets granted through the states. So we don't have particular funding source. What we are able to do, at least within our region, and again, our region is Maine down to Virginia. We're able to actually provide assistance, like we're doing with the meeting house in Vermont. We're able to provide some guidance and some technical assistance, if not actual money. Somebody had mentioned the African American Cemetery Project. That did pass Congress. They had to take several runs at it, and finally, this was Sherrod Brown, senator from Ohio, that was championing this, along with Lonnie Bunch, is head of the Smithsonian. They got that act through, but it came through without funding. So I know the Park Service right now, and it's going to be run through the Park Service out of Washington. They're looking for ways in which trying to put funding together, and we're hoping they'll get an actual appropriation. This happens not too infrequently, where an act will be created, but there won't be money targeted for it as well. So it's kind of hard to get things done, but I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get some funding at some point through for that. In the meantime, we're trying to get things set up.
Great. Again, the chat has a lot of really vibrant conversation going on. And I think that the presentations were all really fabulous. I don't know if any of the Martha has her hand up. I'm going to let Martha ask her question.
Just about the funding. The towns in Massachusetts that have adopted the Community Preservation Act have really, I think, been a great advantage. And a number of the projects I've worked on, not conserving stones, although a lot of funding is being dedicated to that, has come from CPA funding. And so if you're in a community that has adopted the Community Preservation Act, those of you who know about this program, a certain percentage of the funds have to be applied to historic preservation efforts, and cemeteries are typically part of that. That's a really good thing to look into. And if your town hasn't adopted it, I would definitely try to advocate for it, because it's been, at least in Northampton, but it's been a tremendous support for our historic resources, as well as others, but historic resources. So.
Yeah, when we do work, just to add to what Martha's saying, when we do work, if we're restoring an entire site, like we do in Peabody, that's CPA, that's Community Preservation Act money, like what Martha's saying. If we're restoring like 10 gravestones, sometimes you'll see that we're restoring just a family plot. That's either a grant from Essex National Heritage, or that's coming directly from cemetery funds, the budget that the cemetery has set aside, and sometimes need to expand going to town meeting. We live in a town meeting. So if you're seeing us work, it's usually those two sources of funding. And of course, I think Mass Historical has funding too, that you can apply for, but you have to match it. We've never used Mass Historical's funds, but we stick mostly to CPA and cemetery budgets or tiny grants. That helps.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So Mass MHC, we do have our Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund grants. And those are available for physical preservation work on municipal and nonprofit owned properties. So not just cemeteries, but also buildings. The resources do have to be listed on the state register of historic places. And it is a 50% matching grant process. So you do have to match it with 50% of the funds. But we do have funding available for physical preservation work. Those grants are usually announced in like November, December. That's kind of when the process opens for the applications then. So certainly keep an eye out for that.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our, we've got we're just at time. I know it's got about 3 minutes. So I don't know if I think we've had wonderful presentations, and I don't know if any of the other steering committee members have any kind of parting words that they want to make, or if we're all at this point we're all great, and we'll Stacia and Preservation Mass will be posting and sharing resources. And I know the chat, as I said, was very, very robust. So hopefully we can get some of that information pulled together and either email it out or put it up with the notes from the meeting. But thank you so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And to echo, we'll try to get that stuff up in the next few days or so, and by the end of the week. So give us a couple days, but we'll do what we can to do it quickly. Thank you.
Very great. And thank you, Preservation Mass, especially for facilitating the Zoom. It's always a little intimidating with a larger group. So thank you so much. It's a lot of work.
You're welcome.
All right. And we will be in touch. I'm not sure what planning for as far as the Western Mass group. I'm not sure which of us it's maybe Pioneer Valley's turn. I have to kind of regroup and figure out who's up next. So but we'll be in touch definitely with I guess a winter presentation. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys.
Thanks, everybody.